International instruments consider bilateral labor agreements as a good practice, and they provide a solid foundation of principles and good practices to develop them. For instance, the ILO Migration for Employment Convention recommends, whenever necessary or desirable, conclusion of agreements by countries to regulate migration for employment in cases where numbers of migrants are sufficiently large. The convention also provides a blueprint for developing agreements. So the golden age of bilateral labor agreements, we think it is between the 1950s and 60s, when there was a huge demand for labor for reconstruction of post-war Europe. So 1950s and 60s represent the golden age of bilateral agreements, and they form the institutional backbone of labor migration movements in Europe. The good features in this golden age was main focus on labor recruitment and greater demand and competition for migrant workers. With the result, workers got improved agreements and working conditions. And they followed the ILO model agreement closely. Unfortunately, following post-1970, there was a decline in these agreements. The major cause was the oil crisis and the start of what we call Fortress Europe, where Europe started initiating barriers to mobility. So only mobility that took place was for family unification, not for labor and workers. So there was reduced labor demand, and there was also growth of irregular migration. And then, of course, there was a surge because there was a Gulf, with the Gulf boom, there was demand for temporary workers. And so there were seasonal worker agreements, there were new countries of immigration. The objectives also got wider. They were curbing irregular migration, security concerns, and promoting development linkages, and also less attention to international norms. So we call these the second generation bilateral labor agreements, which mushroomed in Asia, mostly South-South agreements, Asian origin countries with GCC countries. European agreement in this second generation had multiple objectives under the global approach to migration and mobility of the European Union, curbing irregular migration, promoting legal migration opportunities, and migration and development. So North-South agreements with Africa and also with and Latin America, and agreements with newly independent states in Eastern and Central Europe. In Latin America, there are both South-South agreements, Argentina with Bolivia, Peru, and South-South with Spain and South-North with Spain and Canada. So the new forms were government-to-government agreements, and then European Union third country mobility partnerships, and also you have new circular migration agreements, which did not really take off, and then you have dedicated agreements for health workers and domestic workers. In the recent years, we see the emergence of some positive developments. One is, of course, this dedicated domestic worker agreements of Saudi Arabia with origin countries. They incorporate strong protection for this vulnerable group. And you also have reciprocal bilateral labor agreements, India and Malaysia in 2009, and new migration laws and policies with articles on the role of bilateral agreements. There is also revival of government-to-government agreements and public employment services. And now you find more rights-based agreements also. These agreements and MOUs contain references to rights and protection, equal treatment, women migrant workers. The best example is the Jordan-Nepal agreement concluded last year. And the Global Compact on Migration also has a very strong recommendation on bilateral labor agreements. And with new laws in for domestic workers in GCC countries, these new agreements also can incorporate these features. So we think there will be more promising agreements in the future, but of course the main issue is not so much the content, but actual implementation, where things have fallen short up to now. But with the support of international organizations and more bargaining between origin and destination countries, we expect the situation to improve.